17 black celebrities who battled incurable diseases. Some of the black stars the world admired most were smiling in public, while their bodies were quietly failing in private. Behind the fame, the standing ovations, and the image of success were battles no spotlight could soften and no fortune could stop. Tonight, we uncover the pain hidden behind the legend. Stay with us until the end, because some of these stories are far more tragic than fans ever imagined.
To live in a space.
Chadwick Boseman. Chadwick Boseman's story hurts because the world was looking at strength while his body was quietly moving toward collapse. In 2016, he was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, and he told almost no one outside the people closest to him. Then came the years that make his story so difficult to forget. While audiences saw a man standing tall in some of the biggest films of his life, he was moving through surgeries and chemotherapy in private, carrying pain the public could not see. The image was heroic, but the reality beneath it was far more fragile. A man trying to protect his work, his dignity, and his peace, while illness kept taking more from him. That is what gives his silence its weight. He did not turn his diagnosis into a public performance. He did not ask the world to stop and pity him. He kept going. He filmed. He worked. He showed up, and all the while the disease was advancing. By the time the truth reached the public, it was already too late to look back without pain. The cancer had progressed to stage 4, and in August 2020, Chadwick Boseman died at 43 at home with his wife and family beside him. And ask yourself this: how many people around us look powerful, accomplished, even untouchable, while carrying a private battle they may never speak about? That is why Chadwick's story lingers so deeply. It is not only a story about death, it is a story about grace under pressure, about pain hidden behind purpose, and about a man who kept giving the world his best, even as his body was asking for more than it could give. Bernie Mac. Bernie Mac's story is tragic because the man the public knew was all force, loud, sharp, funny, impossible to ignore, while the body carrying that force had been under strain for years. He was diagnosed with sarcoidosis in 1983, a disease that can inflame organs, especially the lungs. And though reports later said the condition had gone into remission, it never fully disappeared from the background of his life. That is what makes his final chapter so painful. By the time audiences were seeing the confidence, the timing, the swagger, and that unmistakable stage authority, there was already a quieter battle moving behind it. What makes the story cut deeper is how ordinary the ending first seemed. In July 2008, Mac was hospitalized in Chicago after developing difficulty breathing and a fever. It was diagnosed as pneumonia, and at first the people around him hoped it would be temporary, just one more hospital stay, one more recovery. But the situation worsened. His family later said his history of sarcoidosis had left his immune system compromised, and that made the infection more dangerous. In his last days, he was on a ventilator struggling for air, while the people who loved him most stood nearby, hoping he could still turn the corner. And ask yourself this: how heartbreaking is it when someone who spent a lifetime lifting other people's spirits reaches the end, fighting for something as basic as one more breath? On August 9, 2008, Bernie Mac died at 50 from complications of pneumonia at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His wife Rhonda and their daughter Janice were with him, and family members later recalled that doctors tried to revive him more than once. That is why his death still lands so hard. It was not only that comedy lost one of its most powerful voices, it was that a man so full of life was taken in a way that felt cruelly physical, intimate, and sudden, not on a stage, not under a spotlight, but in a hospital room, breath by breath. Dilla. Dilla's story feels especially tragic because his final chapter was not just about dying young. It was about creating while his body was steadily giving way. By the mid-2000s, James Yancey was battling thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, or TTP, along with lupus illnesses that weakened him so badly that by late 2005, the seriousness of his condition had become visible to the public when he appeared on a European tour in a wheelchair. Around that same period, Stone's Throw's own account described him back in a hospital bed at Cedars-Sinai, unable to walk and barely able to speak. The image is painful to sit with one of the most inventive minds in hip-hop, trapped inside a body that was failing him day by day. What makes his death hit even harder is what he did with the little strength he had left. On February 7, 2006, his 32nd birthday, Dilla released Donuts, the last album issued during his lifetime. It was a record made under the shadow of illness, and whether every piece of it was finished in the hospital or not, the emotional truth remains the same. He was making urgent, beautiful music while life was narrowing around him. Then just 3 days later, on February 10th, he died at home in Los Angeles from cardiac arrest, linked to those illnesses. And ask yourself this: what kind of artist keeps building something beautiful when he can already feel the end moving closer? That is why J. Dilla's story lingers. His death was not only sad because he was young, it was tragic because he seemed to know time was shortening. And instead of retreating, he turned those final days into a farewell that still sounds alive. Stuart Scott. Stuart Scott's story is devastating because his final years were defined by a contradiction almost too painful to sit with. On television, he still looked like momentum itself, sharp, energized, unmistakably alive. But behind that familiar confidence was a man fighting appendiceal cancer, a rare disease first discovered in 2007 when doctors removed his appendix and found a tumor. He went through surgeries and chemotherapy, was declared cancer-free for a time, then watched the disease return. By 2013, he had undergone another major surgery, and yet he kept showing up, kept working, kept speaking with the same conviction people had always trusted. That is what makes his story so hard to forget. The public was still seeing the voice of assurance, while his body was being pushed through one of the harshest private wars of his life. What gives the story its deeper tragedy is the way he chose to fight. Stuart did not retreat quietly into bitterness. He pushed himself physically, and kept trying to stay present for his daughters while enduring a punishing cycle of treatment. Reports after his death noted that he had gone through 58 chemotherapy infusions and 3 extensive abdominal surgeries. Even then, he refused to let cancer become the full meaning of his life. At the 2014 SPIS, shortly after another surgery, he stood on stage and delivered the line that now feels almost unbearable. In retrospect, you do not beat cancer only by surviving it, but by the way you live while facing it. And ask yourself this: how much strength does it take to keep inspiring people when your own body is being carved away piece by piece? On January 4th, 2015, Stuart Scott died at 49 after a battle that had lasted more than 7 years. That is why his death still hits so hard. It was not just the loss of a broadcaster. It was the loss of a man who kept radiating life while death was already standing much closer than anyone wanted to believe. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's story cuts so deeply because his illness did not stay private. It unfolded under the harshest light possible, the gaze of the entire world. By the early 1990s, his changing skin had become one of the most discussed and most cruelly misunderstood subjects in popular culture. In his 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, Jackson said he had vitiligo, a chronic condition in which the skin loses pigment in patches, and insisted he was still proud of who he was. But public curiosity had already curdled into suspicion. Instead of seeing a man dealing with a visible medical condition, millions chose to see a symbol, a scandal, a spectacle. That is where the tragedy becomes more intimate. Vitiligo is not considered life-threatening, but NIH and Mayo Clinic both note that it can be psychologically devastating, especially because it is so visible and often progresses over time. In Jackson's case, the autopsy later confirmed depigmented areas on his chest, abdomen, face, and arms. Years after his death, Prince Jackson said his father had deep insecurity about looking blotchy and tried to smooth out his appearance because the condition made him self-conscious. That detail changes the emotional center of the story. This was not vanity in the shallow way people claimed. It was a man trying to survive inside a body that was changing in public while strangers argued over what those changes meant. And ask yourself this: how lonely must a person become when illness alters his body in full view? And the world answers not with compassion, but with ridicule. That is why Michael Jackson still lingers as a tragedy. His death in 2009 came from acute propofol intoxication, not from vitiligo itself. But long before that final night illness, scrutiny and relentless public misunderstanding had already pressed him into a kind of isolation very few people could survive with grace. Hank Gathers. Hank Gathers' story feels especially cruel because he looked like the last person anyone would expect to lose a battle with his own body. At 6'7", powerful, explosive, and relentless, he had become one of college basketball's most overwhelming forces. In 1989, he became only the second NCAA Division I player ever to lead the nation in both scoring and rebounding in the same season, turning Loyola Marymount into one of the most thrilling teams in the country. He looked built for the future. That is what makes what happened next so devastating. In December 1989, Gathers collapsed during a game against UC Santa Barbara and was diagnosed with a serious heart rhythm problem. He was prescribed the beta blocker Incurable, but teammates and later reporting recalled that the medication seemed to sap his strength and dull the force that made him so dominant. The dosage was reduced, and he returned to the court still trying to play at the same furious pace that had made him a star. And ask yourself this: how tragic is it when the very thing keeping someone alive also seems to take away the gifts that made him feel most like himself? Then came March 4th, 1990, in the WCCC tournament semifinal against Portland. Gathers caught an alley-oop slammed home. A dunk ran back toward midcourt and suddenly collapsed. He was taken to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead at 23. An autopsy later found hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a heart muscle disorder linked to sudden death in young athletes. That is why his death still lingers. It was not just a loss. It was the sight of youth strength and promise being cut down in public in seconds before anyone could believe it was really happening. Charlie Murphy. Charlie Murphy's story is tragic in a quieter, more unsettling way because his final battle did not unfold in public. He was the kind of man people associated with toughness, a Navy veteran, a sharp-edged comedian, a performer whose voice always carried forth sarcasm and the feeling that life had already tried its best to harden him. That is why the end feels so cruel. In April 2017, Murphy died at 57 in a New York hospital after battling leukemia. His manager said he had been undergoing chemotherapy, but to most of the public, the full gravity of his illness remained largely hidden until the news of his death arrived. What gives the story its deeper ache is the silence around it. There was no long public farewell, no carefully managed final act, no extended window for fans to prepare themselves for what was coming. Charlie Murphy stayed. Charlie Murphy almost to the end, funny, guarded, and unwilling to let sickness become the thing that defined him in public. Then came that final message posted just before his death. Release the past to rest as deeply as possible. Read now, it feels less like a casual thought and more like a man standing at the edge of something he understood better than anyone around him. And ask yourself this: what makes a death feel so heavy? The illness itself, or the way a strong man can disappear behind it without ever letting the world see how much he was suffering? That is why Charlie Murphy's death still stings. It was not only the loss of a gifted comedian, it was the loss of a man who looked built to endure, yet was taken by a disease that worked in private, stripped him down in private, and left the world with shock instead of closure. Reggie White. Reggie White's death feels tragic because it struck at the exact place people assumed he was strongest. To the public, he was power made visible, a giant of a man, a legend whose nickname, the Minister of Defense, sounded almost larger than football itself. But on the morning of December 26, 2004, that image shattered. White was taken from his home in Cornelius, North Carolina, to a nearby hospital in Huntersville, where he was pronounced dead at just 43 years old. His wife, Sarah, had called 911. The shock was immediate because, as a family spokesman said at the time, he did not look like a dying man. He still seemed vibrant, energetic, alive. The night before, he had even gone to see Fat Albert with family and friends. What makes the story cut deeper is that the danger had been there for years, but it was the kind of danger a man like Reggie White could carry without the world fully understanding it. His family said he had lived with sarcoidosis for several years, describing it as a respiratory condition that affected his sleep. Then came the preliminary autopsy. The Mecklenburg County medical examiner said White most likely had a condition affecting how much air his lungs could hold, leading to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia, and also said sleep apnea may have been a factor. That is what makes the ending feel so cruel. A man known for overwhelming force was taken in his sleep by illnesses that worked in silence. And ask yourself this: how cruel is it when someone who looked indestructible could be slipping toward death in the one place every human being must surrender: sleep? That is why Reggie White's death still carries such weight. It was not just sudden. It was intimate, quiet, and frighteningly ordinary in its setting: a home, a bed, a family nearby, which somehow makes it even harder to bear. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor's story is tragic because the man who once seemed powered by pure electricity ended up trapped inside a body that moved more slowly every year. In 1986, Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that attacks the central nervous system. At first, the decline was not dramatic enough for the whole world to understand what was happening. But over time, the damage became impossible to hide. By the early 1990s, the same man who had once stalked a stage with explosive energy was increasingly limited, and major biographies note that he was eventually confined to a wheelchair. What makes his story hurt so much is the cruel contrast at its center. Pryor's gift had always been motion as much as language, the pacing, the sudden turns, the way his whole body seemed involved in the joke. Then multiple sclerosis began taking that body away from him piece by piece. Even so, he kept working. He appeared in films after the diagnosis, published his autobiography, Prior Convictions and Other Life Sentences, in 1995, and even played a man with multiple sclerosis on Chicago Hope that same year. There is something almost unbearable in that image: a comedian famous for turning pain into material, now living inside an illness he could no longer outrun. And ask yourself this: how cruel is it when the very body that carried a person's genius becomes the prison that genius has to live inside? On December 10, 2005, Richard Pryor died of a heart attack at a Los Angeles area hospital. But the deeper tragedy had begun long before that final day. Multiple sclerosis had already narrowed his world, slowed his movements, and turned one of the most physically alive performers in American comedy into a man forced to fight for dignity inside stillness. Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman's story is tragic because his body became a prison long before the world understood what it was looking at. He was born with a severe kidney disorder, widely reported as focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and the illness, along with the treatments used to keep him alive, permanently altered his growth. He stopped at 4 feet 8 inches, and by the time most children were only beginning to understand sickness, Gary had already entered a cycle of hospitals, medication, and surgery. Reuters reported that he underwent 2 kidney transplants in his lifetime, while later coverage noted that he also depended on regular dialysis for years. What the public saw as a memorable face was for him the visible mark of a body that had been forced into survival too early. That is what makes his story so painful. The face that made him famous also trapped him. The same childlike appearance that turned him into a television icon kept the world from ever fully seeing him as an adult man, living with chronic illness, medical fatigue, and physical limitation. He was not simply small. He was carrying a lifelong condition that kept taking from him in ways cameras could not explain. And that is where the real sadness settles in. How lonely must it feel when the illness that stole your body's future also becomes the very image the world refuses to let you outgrow? In May 2010, Coleman was hospitalized after a fall at his Utah home and died at 42 from an intracranial hemorrhage. But the deeper tragedy had begun decades earlier. long before that final injury disease had already narrowed his body, his freedom, and the shape of the life he was allowed to live. T-Boz. T-Boz's story is powerful because her life began under a prediction that sounded almost like a sentence. She was diagnosed with sickle cell disease at age 7, and she later said doctors told her she would never live past 30, would be disabled her whole life, and would never have children. Those are not words a child is supposed to carry. Yet she carried them into adulthood, into fame, and into one of the most recognizable groups in music history. While TLC was becoming a global force, T-Boz was still living with a blood disorder that could trigger extreme pain, hospitalization, and life-threatening complications without warning. What makes her story hit so hard is that the battle did not stay in childhood. In her memoir, excerpted by people, she described falling into a coma after breastfeeding, explaining that the fluid loss put terrifying stress on a body already vulnerable because of sickle cell disease. She also revealed that she later faced a brain tumor, a second health crisis that made her survival feel even more improbable. In another public interview, she said she had even lost her spleen because of the disease. That means her story is not just about pain episodes or a difficult diagnosis. It is about a body being pushed to the edge again and again while she kept finding a way to step back into life. And ask yourself this: how strong does a person have to be to grow up under a death sentence, then keep living long enough to prove every prediction wrong? That is why T-Boz's story stays with people. She did not simply survive a diagnosis. She outlived the fear that was supposed to define her. Toni Braxton. Toni Braxton's story cuts deep because lupus did not just threaten her health. It threatened the one thing her whole life had been built around: the ability to stand in front of people and still look untouchable. She has said it took years and multiple doctors before she finally got a diagnosis, and that the turning point came after she collapsed during a Las Vegas performance. In 2010, when she finally spoke publicly, CBS quoted her calling herself a survivor. But survival was never the glamorous part of this story. The real pain was that her body had already started sending warnings long before the world had a name for what was happening. What makes her story even more haunting is how much she felt she had to hide. In 2024, Braxton said she was told to keep her lupus diagnosis quiet because people get scared around sick celebrities, and because insurance and work opportunities could disappear if the industry decided she was too risky. That detail says everything. Even after getting answers, she was not simply allowed to be ill. She had to be marketable, insurable, and reassuring while living with a disease that can attack the joints, lungs, kidneys, and heart. Then came the part that makes the story feel almost unbearably cruel. In 2023, people reported that she underwent a traumatic heart procedure after doctors found 80% blockage in her left main coronary artery, a complication connected to her lupus. She later said doctors once feared she might need a heart transplant and might never perform again. And ask yourself this: how terrifying must it be when the disease inside your body starts attacking the very heart that keeps your voice, your rhythm, and your life moving forward? That is why Toni Braxton's story stays with people. Not because lupus defeated her, but because it kept reaching for the center of who she was, and she kept stepping back into the light anyway. Karen Clark Sheard. Karen Clark. Sheard's story is so moving because death did not take her, but it came frighteningly close enough to change the meaning of every note she sang after. In 2001, after an elective surgery, she suffered devastating complications and slipped into a coma. Her daughter Kiara later said she had nearly died, and that memory became so painful and so sacred that Kiara turned it into music on You Don't Know. Karen herself later recalled an even darker picture. After the surgery, she developed a blood clot in her lungs. Then another in her leg, fell into a coma for about 3.5 weeks, and doctors gave her only a 2% chance of survival. That is what gives her story its real depth. This was not simply a singer recovering from illness. This was a woman whose body had brought her to the edge of silence. She later said she was bedridden for so long that doctors told her she might need rehabilitation just to relearn how to use her limbs. And the thought that cut deepest was not only fear of death, it was fear that she might never sing again. For someone like Karen Clark Sheard, that was more than a medical crisis. That was the possibility of losing the very sound through which the world had come to know her. And ask yourself this: how changed must a person be after coming that close to death, then having to return to the same voice that once felt as natural as breathing? That is why her story lingers. She did not just recover. She came back with an album called Second Chance, a title that only carries its full weight once you know what she had already survived. Seal. Seal's story is haunting because the scars the world learned to recognize as part of his image began as something frightening, painful, and deeply personal. In a PBS interview, he said it started around his 21st birthday as a small spot on one side of his face and then got progressively worse. He later learned it was discoid lupus, a chronic cutaneous form of lupus. Medical references describe discoid lupus erythematosus as a condition that often affects the head and neck and can leave lasting scarring, discoloration, and atrophy. So the marks on Seal's face were never just cosmetic. They were the visible remains of a disease that changed him permanently. What makes his story cut deeper is that the illness did not simply leave scars. It forced him to live in a face the public could not stop staring at. Seal has said that when it first happened, neither he nor the doctors around him really understood what they were dealing with. That kind of uncertainty has its own cruelty. Discoid lupus is not usually described as fatal, but authoritative medical sources note that it can cause substantial psychological harm because of the permanent disfigurement it may leave behind. That is where Seal's story becomes more than a story about appearance. It becomes a story about learning to carry visible damage without letting that damage become your whole identity. And what does it do to a person when pain leaves a mark the world can see but not the fear that came with it? That is why Seal's story lingers. The scars never disappeared. He simply learned how to stand inside them until the world stopped seeing only the wound and started hearing the man. Missy Elliott. Missy Elliott's story is powerful because her body began failing her at the very moment the world still expected her to move like pure force. In 2008, she was diagnosed with Graves' disease, an autoimmune thyroid disorder, after frightening symptoms began interfering with the most basic acts of control. She later said her leg would jump while she was driving, and at one point she almost crashed because she could not keep the brake pressed down. She also described a wave of other symptoms that followed: hair loss, mood swings, weight loss, tremors, and weakness so severe she could barely hold a pen. Those details matter because they strip away the glamour. This was not a vague health scare. This was a woman whose nervous system was beginning to turn ordinary movement into uncertainty. What makes the story cut deeper is that the illness did not just affect her body. It altered her relationship to visibility itself. In a 2024 People interview, Missy said the disease led to severe weight loss, a period of depression, and years of stepping back from the spotlight while still trying to create behind the scenes. Even when she kept writing and producing, the struggle was still there, just hidden from the public. And that is where the real ache lives. The world often mistakes absence for comfort when sometimes absence is simply survival. And ask yourself this: how frightening must it be when the same body that once gave you rhythm, control, and confidence suddenly refuses to obey you? That is why Missy Elliott's story stays with people. She did not disappear because the talent was gone. She stepped back because her body forced a reckoning, and then she found a way to return with that same imagination still intact. Winnie Harlow. Winnie Harlow's story is powerful because the illness that marked her skin also tried very early to mark her sense of worth. She was diagnosed with vitiligo at age 4, and in a 2025 interview with People, she said that as a child she often felt like she was the only person in the world with it. That detail says everything about the loneliness at the center of her story. Vitiligo did not threaten her life, but it changed the way she was seen, and more painfully, the way she was made to see herself. In school, she was bullied so relentlessly that the condition became larger than skin. It became isolation, humiliation, and the feeling of being looked at before being understood. What gives the story its depth is that the public eventually celebrated the very thing that had once made childhood feel unbearable. By adulthood, the same patchwork skin that had made her feel alone became the feature the fashion world could not ignore. But that transformation was not magic. It was survival. Harlow has said one of the hardest parts of growing up with vitiligo was the lack of information and the absence of anyone who looked like her. That means her rise was not simply about modeling. It was about becoming the visible proof she never had when she was young. And ask yourself this: how much strength does it take to grow up inside a body the world keeps staring at and still learn not to see yourself through its cruelty? That is why Winnie Harlow's story stays with people. She did not defeat vitiligo by making it disappear. She defeated the shame that other people tried to attach to it. Danny Glover. Long before Danny Glover became a face associated with calm, dignity, and command, he was living with the fear that his own body could suddenly betray him. According to the Epilepsy Foundation, his first epileptic seizure came when he was 15 years old, and for the next 20 years, he lived under the shadow of a condition that could strike without warning. That is what gives his story its weight. Epilepsy did not simply threaten his health. It disrupted certainty. It turned ordinary spaces into places of tension. A room, a street, a crowd, even a quiet moment could become dangerous in seconds. What makes the story more powerful is not just the illness itself, but the discipline it forced into him. The Epilepsy Foundation says Glover eventually learned to live with the condition while still building a major career, and that after roughly 2 decades, the seizures stopped for reasons no one could fully explain. That detail matters because it means some of the most formative years of his life were shaped by uncertainty, self-control, and the constant need to steady himself against something invisible. He was not fighting an enemy people could see. He was fighting the possibility of losing command over himself at any moment. And ask yourself this: how differently would a person walk through life if he never fully knew when his own body might suddenly take control away from him? That is why Danny Glover's story stays with people. Not because illness defeated him, but because it tested him deeply before success ever arrived. These stories remind us that fame can make suffering look distant, but it never makes it disappear. Some of these stars kept fighting in silence. Others were misunderstood until it was far too late. And maybe that is the hardest truth of all. The public often celebrates strength without ever asking what that strength is costing behind closed doors. Which story stayed with you the most, and which one do you think the world failed to understand while they were still here? Share your thoughts in the comments and follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed for more untold stories hidden behind fame, pain, and legacy.